Tough Call Mediation is brought to you by Herb Legal LLP, serving your mediation and freelance paralegal needs in Ontario, New York, Quebec, and throughout North America. Connect to their website today at www.herblawservices.com.
Welcome to Tough Call, a mediation podcast. My name is C.T. Ayler, and I'm here with my lovely friend Dale Sheldon.
Hello.
We're also here with Jayla. So if you hear her panting in the background, she's just sitting here very pleased with herself, loving on Dale.
Yeah. She got to run a moment ago. Tongue's hanging out.
Yeah, in the heat of
Jayla
summer.
is a dog, by the way,
yeah.
Just in case. You know.
Just a little bit of levity right before we jump into a pretty heavy topic. I mean, Dale and I, in the beginning of both of our podcasts, we're like, we don't want to get into anything too heavy. But here's the thing. When mediation is involved, it's always a fairly heavy topic because it's conflict and people are trying to resolve things. And then we're talking about it coming onto an international stage. How mediation plays a role. International mediation helps countries in dispute resolve their issue, or cultures or nationalities who are trying to self-identify. There's a lot. And we've been feeling a little reluctant simply because there's just so much conflict these days.
Yeah. So much of it.
So polarized.
Too much.
Yeah. And I think that's part of why I've been pushing to do a mediation podcast, just because I think it's really important that we talk about the fact that, okay, yeah, we have conflict, but we can resolve it. I'm just a hippie at heart. Can't we all just get along? Yeah, but there's 10 major conflicts that was identified in an Al Jazeera article. And I thought it was actually a pretty good one, considering the sheer volume of conflicts that are going on in the world today, whether it's in your own country or internationally, whether it's between countries. It's just one of those things that it's such a big escalating. It feels like we're in this pressure cooker. And I get it. I get that there's a lot of people that just want to go onto their phone and scroll through TikTok, or they want to play Candy Crush 8 million times, or they want to run away and see the latest concert, or they just want to go and hang out with their friends. Like it's such a heavy thing that's happening in the world right now. And we're really lucky to be living in a part of the world that actually doesn't have as much conflict. Yeah. And people are coming to these countries in waves, because this is, I'm going to try to find the quote for you listeners, but I've heard it from several places, but this is considered to be one of the greatest eras of displaced population in the history of the world ever. I'm going to fact check that, but I think if you are thinking about previous, like if we're thinking about the Ukraine right now, if we're thinking about Gaza, if we're thinking about Syria, if we're thinking about the exodus of the U.S. in Afghanistan, if we're thinking about just all of these conflicts that we're going to be bringing up as well. There's a lot of people who are just migrating, and they're just looking for a new place to be. And Canada and the U.S. is relatively stable compared to the rest of the world right now. So I can understand and appreciate how some people go, yeah, it really sucks where I live.
Well, I mean, there are huge populations going into Europe as well. France and England and all over Europe.
Yeah. But I can see how there's some people that are going, it really sucks where I live. Yeah. Let's go there. Maybe it's calmer there for me and my family.
And in many cases, they don't even, where is almost irrelevant. A good friend in Algeria, or was in Algeria, and he just needed to get out. And eventually, initially he went to Brazil.
Right.
He was able to get out to Brazil, and then he went to the Netherlands, and he's there now. New life for himself, but he's safe.
He's safe. He's not dead.
Yeah.
And really, I think it's very easy. I live in 2 areas where a lot of people get angry and they say, oh, it's just too easy to get in Canada. It's just too easy to get into the U.S. I assure you, as someone who has imported my husband into Canada, who is a U.S. citizen, and as a Canadian citizen who is trying to get into the U.S., it is not easy.
No, it's ridiculous.
And everyone say, oh, well, you're trying to do it the right way. It's like, it still takes time
years,
no matter what.
And you have the luxury of at least being able to live here during that process. Whereas other people, they can't even get the resident visa to be here in the meantime.
Well, I'm on a visitor technically every time I come back because I'm still living in Canada, but I get to come here on
That's
the weekends.
what I mean. Yeah.
And there's some people who can't. I mean, I know so many people because I grew up in Toronto, people who immigrated to Toronto as a single person and then slowly over time got to sponsor their spouse, their children, their parents, or their in-laws or something. And then if they happen to be relatively successful in business, sometimes their friends from back home would be like, please, I want to work for you. Please, please help me.
Yeah.
And the responsibility when you're like, I knew many, many years ago, this man who started up I'm not going to say what company it is. And I'm not going to say what part of the world he was from, but trust this part of the world is still, to this day, a lot of very, very poor, destitute people come from there. And so when he got here and he managed to be successful in like the late 60s, early 70s, and he managed to grow a company that could hire people, he was pressured by his relatives and his friends, please bring us over. And so he did. Even though he was finding workers in Canada, he also felt a huge duty to the people because he grew up in abject poverty. And we can't tell that person, oh, just forget about everyone you ever knew back home. Just pay attention to the people you live with here. That's hard, especially when there's language barriers, especially when there's cultural divides. I understand the need. Having been an expat living in other cultures, I lived in Asia for 4 years in a country that didn't speak English. So I did gravitate towards English speakers. I mean, I met people who were, native to that area as well. And I did my best to learn the language. But Mandarin is hard.
Yeah, it's a hard one.
It's really tough. It is not easy to learn.
But then too, at least there's an expat community of English speakers and Europeans in that part of the world. Like a lot of time, depending on where the person's coming from and coming here, they don't have that either. Like my ex was from Brazil and moved to Los Angeles. And there was the entire Brazilian community was like, out of all of LA, which is a huge
millions
place.
Upon millions of people.
Yeah, there was one little supermercado with a little, and then there's a couple of like Brazilian restaurants around, but they're like not actually run by any Brazilian people most of the time.
Right.
I remember there's a place called La Vaca, which is a like a chain restaurant in a bunch of malls, and they market themselves as a Brazilian steakhouse, which should be read as a churrascaria. That's what a Brazilian steakhouse is, right? But they don't use the word churrascaria. And even the word la vaca, which means the cow, is Spanish. Portuguese is a vaca. There's no L. So like, why is the name of your place in the wrong language? And
Yeah.
I went there. I was like, do you have any Guarana? Do you have any Coxinha? And they're like, they had no idea what I was even talking about.
Oh, no.
And those are like basic staples in Brazil.
I know. When I lived in Thailand for a while, and when I first came back, people were like, oh, I know this really great Thai place. It's like really authentic Thai, like people who are Thai who run it. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really cool. No, run by Koreans. You know, and it's not like a Korean person absolutely can open up a Thai place. But the fact that they were so ignorant to the fact that Koreans are very different
Very,
from
very
Thai
different,
people.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's get back to war.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're living in troubling times. And the thing is, you know, mediation, when you're even getting into it, you have to know the kind of nature of conflict that you're dealing with. And you have to understand some of the context of how there's choices that are being made. And I almost decided to get into a huge review of an essay that I found online, and I geeked out about it so much. I was telling Dale all about it, and I was just trying to take just quotes from it. But my notes were, how many pages one time you got here?
Oh, your notes, just your notes were 26 pages long.
It's like, okay, I'll cut it down. So I will post it in the show notes, but this is such a great breakdown of aspects of mediation, what it is, what international conflict looks like, how it shows up in international conflicts. I absolutely love it. I now think Irina Sarrazin, I hope I'm saying her last name okay. I'm a huge fan of her academic work now. So it's called International Mediation in Theory and Practice, Lessons of Nagorno-Karabakh.
I think it's Nagorno-Karabakh.
Karabakh.
I think.
Karabakh.
I'm not sure, but
Yeah. So we're talking about the Azerbaijan, Armenian sort of conflict. And what was really amazing, this is what made me geek out, is her paper came out a while ago. But she even said in her paper, because this wasn't fully addressed, there were problems with how it was done from a mediation perspective, from a conflict resolution between nations and interest groups. This is not done. It's going to come up again. And it's like she was a prophet. It was amazing. But she even talks about, like, she really lays out what people need to look for in conflict on an international stage and how that breaks down. And I like in the very beginning, she said, there are 4 not necessarily concurrent conditions that indicate the ripeness of the conflict: hurting stalemate to the conflict, looming catastrophe, valid representatives, and a way out of the conflict. Now, she gets into a lot of breakdown about what that means. But when you're thinking about international actors, I'm trying to summarize it as best I can. But I think the best focus point for a mediator is, of course, D. Is there a way out of this conflict? Because in international escalation, very rarely is there a way out.
yeah.
By the time they've called in a peacemaker or a peacekeeper, it's already been too late. It's already been festering for maybe not even just a couple of years, maybe for a millennia amongst these people, and different pressures as we've gone into globalization and as different conflicts in other areas or different changes of modernization or just changes of how we've worked as humanity have impacted the ebb and flow of one unique geographical area. You can say, oh, well, this is an isolated incident. And my question is it? Is anything isolated anymore? Maybe Alaska? Not even. No?
Vanuatu, maybe? Senegal Islands. That one is
there we go.
isolated.
That's still pretty isolated. We
the only
found one place in the world that is still isolated. Deep in the heart of Brazilian jungles, because the president of Brazil is tearing it by thousands of acres every single day. The deforestation of people think, the forest fires of Australia back in before COVID, right? Oh, that was such a terrible thing. It's still happening. People are still, because they want to build these massive, developments that change the pattern of how our water table works. It's crazy. But another thing to think of is, how do these unique geographical locations, when there's a conflict or when people are deciding to represent themselves, how do they define themselves? And one really good description is actually from UNESCO, United Nations Economic and Social Cooperation Organization. So UNESCO considers the following indicative characteristics in defining a people, like how they can be self-determined, okay? A common historical tradition, religious or ethnic identity, could be both, cultural homogeneity, linguistic unit, so are they of the same subset at least, religious or ideological affinity, and territorial connection. Oh, sorry, one more, and common economic life. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that per se, but then when we're going into some of the 2024 10 conflicts to watch over this episode.
Well, that one could be like international, I was trying to use a new word and it backfired. A conflict within a nation. With the,
True. But,
class difference.
But how they're saying we're defining ourselves as a people, we are distinct, we have these specific ways of livelihood, like we're goat herders, we're fisher people, like that's our economic livelihood as well, kind of thing is sort of where they're going with that. But you're right. For example, was it last week, I think? Listeners, when this is going to be posted soon, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. Early June, some First Nations people won the rights to whaling again because it's been banned for such a long time. But their right to self-rule, their right to be a distinct culture, one of their economic livelihoods is to whale. And so they've been fighting against other interests, nation to nation building. It was kind of a hard thing for, I think, most, even listeners who live in Canada and America, to think that there are people who consider themselves living in a different nation, even though it's within the borders of Canada or within the borders of the States. The Anishinaabe, or is it the Akwesasne?
We have some very large ones
they're really close to us, that technically that territory goes beyond the Canadian and the U.S. border. So, all right. So how do these self-determined people qualify for statehood? It's really difficult because some people say, well, yeah, we have a statehood, but it was Article 1 of the Montevideo Convention on Rights and Duties of States, signed December 26, 1933. The applicable criteria for statehood are permanent population, defined territory, government, and a capacity to enter into relations with other states. And that definition hasn't really changed. And yet we see internal, like what happened in Rwanda, in Somalia, certain things, what's happening in some of the conflicts we're talking about today. And they are loose boundaries, but not to these people. They see themselves as separate identities. So it's really hard for us to impose these territorial geographical boundaries on a people that have never really followed it for maybe a lot longer than these countries existed.
Yeah.
Right? So what are some of these conflicts? I think the first one to mention is the war in Ukraine right now and the wider European tensions. You know, as many of us know, there's been a lot of conflict that's happening right now. There's pressure, there's threat of war bleeding into other countries in Europe right now. More than 3/4 of European countries spent more on their militaries in 2023. That as the world's most peaceful region fears a possible expansion of Russia's war in Ukraine. This was reported in Al Jazeera, and the 18th edition of the Global Peace Index, produced by the Australia-based Institute Economics and Peace, warned on Tuesday, June 11th, 2024, that the world was at a crossroads with the global number of conflict reaching 56, the most since World War II. 97 countries have deteriorated in peacefulness in 2024, more than any year since the inception of the report in 2008. Wars have also become more international, with 92 countries involved in the conflicts outside their borders, the most since GPI began recording their peacefulness. Over the past decade, peacefulness has declined in 9 out of the 10 years. We're witnessing a record number of conflicts, a rise in militarization, and heightened international strategic competition. While Europe is home to 7 of the 10 most peaceful countries, while Europe is home to 7 of the most peaceful countries, 23 out of the 36 countries in the region have become less peaceful. The 600-mile front is barely moving in the Ukraine. Their counteroffensive has tapered off, with its army having gained little ground, let alone breaching the Russian defenses.
I am curious how they define less peaceful. Like, less peaceful could still be quite peaceful. Like, what do they mean by that?
I think escalating tensions, more polarization, there have been reports of some parties, going either supporting Russia's side just to align their interests economically and for some kind of stability. And then others who, they're just pouring money into their military to assist with this war in Ukraine. And their populations are becoming more conflicted because it's a crazy amount of money that's going in to try to keep the Russian front at bay, to try to keep them out of the Ukraine. In fact, Hungary right now, the current government has sort of softened their stance towards Russia. So it's created a lot of problems with the other European nations. Like, if you're in a European Union and then suddenly you see some of your European Union counterparts softening their stance to a more, not necessarily a pro-Russia, but definitely a more, they could take Ukraine, it's fine. Therein lies more conflict.
Yeah.
Right? So then, of course, we're getting to the other one that has a lot of protests all over the world, which is what's going on in Gaza right now. The Hamas-led attack on 7th of October in 2023 and Israel's subsequent destruction of Gaza have taken the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict into a brand new chapter.
Yeah.
It's so hard because we're going to see in another part, a lot of people, if you say you're pro-Palestinian, apparently you're supposed to be anti-Jewish if you say that. And then if you are pro-Israel, you're apparently racist and anti-Arab. Like, it
doesn't make sense. They're all different things.
Yeah. If there's anything I really understand for mediators that are in there right now, is trying to quell the religious aspect of what's happening, especially how it's being context. You see all these commenters in social media saying, you're anti-Jewish, you're anti, Muslim. It's like, this is not about being Jewish or Muslim. And I think more people need to understand that. This is a territorial conflict that may have a lot of religious foundations in how the people identify themselves and how they enter into the conflict. But it isn't because a Muslim and a Jewish person dislike each other because they're Muslim and Jewish and that they want to kill each other, and that's the only reason. It's way too simplistic. That is not. I'm actually trying to think of the proper word, where you're just boiling it down to this idea that actually it's almost not even theirs, because Hamas is using the people in Palestine as a tool to get more clout, and they're working with Iranian interests and other interests who want to be against Israel. So it's not the people of Gaza that are really having an issue about Israel at all. They don't care. They just want to live peacefully for themselves. But Hamas is using them to gain attention. And then conversely, there are people I know, like I knew a lot of Israelis who were forced into, because conscription is in Israel.
Yeah.
And then they would come into Asia afterwards, and they would just be so upset. They're like, I don't even want to go back to Israel. I'm so done. I hated what I had to do. I hated being a part of this. And they were so miserable and depressed.
Yeah.
And I knew friends at the time as well who, back home in Canada and the US, if they spoke out against their Jewish families and said, listen, I think what we're doing to the Palestinians is wrong, they were not invited back for, like Friday night dinner.
Yeah.
It's like, we're not going to sit with you in the synagogue kind of thing. It still, even now with this, it's boiled over, and families are arguing even in our own countries. And it's so easy to simplify and say, oh, it's just a Muslim Jewish debate. But that's not. There's a lot of other territorial, political, economic interests that are at the heart of this. And it would be, I think, a gross error for people to just boil it down to Muslim versus Jew. It's a big problem to say that.
Yeah.
You're like, sure. Sounds good.
No, I mean, I feel like there's, at its foundation, the religious aspect is there. Like, I feel like that is the catalyst to all of it, but it's not all of it. Like, you're right that you can't put it all in that picture. Like, just how you were saying, there are Jews who left Israel and like don't want to necessarily go back. And I know Jews here in the United States who are not Zionists. They're anti-Zionist. They feel the same way. And the same is happening on the other side of the border too. There are Palestinians who are not members of Hamas. They do not condone that. And those are the people that I really care about. All of these people who are just trying to live their lives. I'm not anti
anything.
I'm not anti or pro-Palestine or Israel. I'm just anti-death and genocide and all this ridiculousness. That's what needs to stop. And that's so hard when it's for such a high, and this is where I feel like religion does come into play, because for such a high percentage of the people that are involved in that conflict, it has a religious hold on them.
Oh, yes.
And that's what's preventing us from being able to actually have logical conversations
de-escalate some of this conflict. Yes.
Yeah, because they're too stubborn. They can't see past the religion.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people just assume that everyone who lives in Israel are just Jewish. I know people who are right. I know people who are Christian who live there. I know people who are Muslim.
Tons of atheists.
Tons of atheists. Yeah. And so I think it's again yet another misnomer, to just put it into that perspective. And the thing is having all of these other surrounding nations dip their toes and fingers in it.
Mm-hmm.
Just, it's not resolving. And this has been going on since October 7th. That was actually a long time ago, more than 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And people are dying, and people are displaced, and people don't have access to running water and food right now as we're speaking.
Yeah.
It's just, more than 85% of Gaza's 2.3 million inhabitants have left their homes, according to the UN, which warns of a public order collapse, famine, and infectious disease, which agencies say soon could claim more lives than the military operations themselves.
Yeah.
That's what's happened. It's like Gaza may cease to exist.
Yeah. And what bothers me about that number, too, that 2.3 million, is there are so many people who just want to dehumanize those people.
That's a lot of people to
That's
dehumanize.
a lot of people, yeah. The majority of them are not extremists. They can't possibly be, even if Hamas has control and is the extremist group.
They weren't involved. A lot of them were not like
the people.
The people. The people were just living their lives, going to school, going to work,
just trying to live day to day, but like the rest of us are.
You know, there's a great book that for toddlers it's called Everybody Poops. Like everyone's just living their lives, just pooping. You know, they're doing their thing, and then Hamas goes and ruins the party. Yeah. Not that Gaza was a great place to be living under all of those sanctions and issues. And I mean, I understand that there's a reason why tunnels were built.
I really feel like we should stay away from any particular event or person starting anything.
Yeah.
Because it's gone on for so long and so many terrible things have happened.
And so many people are dug in. And and I think it's also hard to say that, people... Who cares about the 200 Israeli captives? Like, no. Could you imagine waking up and then knowing your family member was abducted?
Yeah, no, that's terrible. Yeah, that's terrible too.
It's unwinnable. So even though I'm a mediator, people, I'm really glad I'm not an international mediator right now. And I'm really glad I'm not solving the conflict in Gaza. Not that a mediator should. A mediator is there to help sides resolve the conflict for themselves. But I don't know if this. It
feels like
screaming
fixed. Into the wind, though, or spitting even into the wind, even worse.
Yeah. Okay, so the next super fun conflict. It's so even horrible to say super fun. Isn't this fun?
Yeah.
Actually, I'll tell a really fun side story though. When my husband was trying to convince me to move to the States over 10 years ago, he was throwing out all these cool places to live, so he said. And then he sent me this post in Alaska, and I was like, oh, I don't want to go to Alaska. And he goes, yeah, but it'll be really good living. There'll be a lot of pay that I could get because it's a super fund site. And I heard him say a super fun site. I was like, ooh. What's that about? And he's like, what do you mean? I said, well, what's fun about it? He's like, nothing's fun about it. I was like, but it's a super, super fun site. They couldn't have labeled it as fun if it wasn't fun. He goes, no, fund, F-U-N-D, fund.
Yeah.
Oh.
The opposite of fun. Yeah. There are some great parts of Alaska, though.
None that appeal to me. I mean, I might like to visit it one day, but that's it. Watch, we'll all go to Alaska one day. We'll all be like, Alaska's the best place in the world. Who knows?
I'm planning a trip. I need to go to Hope, Alaska. That's a different conversation.
Where we can have some hope?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. All right. So number 3 is Iran and the non-state allies in the wider Middle East conflict in the U.S., which is kind of what we were alluding to earlier. It's a lot of problems with Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and Yemen and what's happening. Who's been trying, Iran's been trying to muddy the waters, and unfortunately it's backfired for them. So we're not going to go into too much for that, because I'm sure there's a lot more people out there who's like, wait, I have a really important opinion about this. And I'm all for it. If you want to sit and weigh in on some of this stuff, it's great. But I want you to think about this. How do you go about resolving it? That's the thing.
It's the only thing that matters in the end. Yeah. So many of these arguments it's so irrelevant, most of it. Mm-hmm. How do we fix it? How do we stop it? How do we keep people from dying?
Well, some people have interests. Like it's like we've talked about this in the past, even with people who work in certain places or people who they rule through disorder.
Yeah.
You know, you wonder, like, how do people function that way? Some people function very well because then they get to be a despot. Yeah. And that's in any workplace, in any way that any town or city can be administered, any country that can be administered. There's probably someone who's like, yeah, if everyone's arguing around me, then I look super great. Yeah. So let's go to the next one, Sudan. And this is displaced millions. Okay, so there was friction between two Sudanese military fractions. I have only heard about this stuff like through cursory flows, like random reports that'll percolate through when I listen to the news on the radio.
Yeah, I know really nothing about it.
Yeah, but it's been going on since 2019. And the thing is, there was a lot of issues that have been going on since Omar al-Bashir's reign. And that is, like, that's been going on for much, much, much longer.
Right.
So this is one of these things to watch this year. Is there's pressure? Is there a genocide imminent? So this is the kind of thing that a peacekeeping mission or a peacemaking mission, which one is it? As a mediator, if you're hired for this region, are you going in to make peace or you're going in to keep peace? Because it's highly volatile right now. The pressure, it's a pressure cooker, just like the Myanmar Burma. So some people still choose to call it Burma. Some people choose to call it Myanmar. But Aung San Suu Kyi, I was heavily involved in her release because she was in home imprisonment for a long time. Finally, they recognized her leadership, and then the military junta essentially made her rule not so great. However, there's so many ethnic issues within that country, the pressures that are going on between them. There are a lot of them, of different groups that have militarized. They've been oppressed for so long. There's been such ongoing famine, forced starvation, forced labor camp working, missing and murdered people that have happened, people who have lived and born and raised in Thai refugee camps or Indian refugee camps, that now there are people who just all they've ever known is war and conflict. So that's the current state of Myanmar. But they're saying over the course of 2023, there's this understanding of more resistant forces, these militia post-coup protests that were crushed initially by the junta. They launched ambushes throughout different parts of the country, and it's still going on. It's just this cycle of violence that is not showing any signs of de-escalating anytime soon. Yeah, there's a lot more you can read about it in an article that I'm going to be putting out, but there is so many issues. It's actually very, very upsetting if you go into any depth of reading it. The types of atrocities that are being committed on random people, random violence. How do you go about resolving these conflicts when all they've ever known is war?
Yeah.
Next up, Ethiopia. So started in 2023, but the northernmost Tigray region, you thought there was this brutal war winding down, but what ended up happening is there were fighting that pitted Tigrayan rebels against federal forces with militias from Amhara region, which borders Tigray, and the Eritrean, I always seem to mess that up, Eritrean troops. And they killed hundreds of thousands of people, according to some estimates, and cut off countless more from food and services. So there are people who have no access to supplies and food and whatnot. And so they're just starving certain regions out. And November 22 agreement brought relief to Tigray, but it set the stage for fighting elsewhere. So they start to create a calm in one place, fighting breaks out in another region. So it's this snowball effect. Next up, Niger, not to be confused with Nigeria, which borders it, but the Niger, Mali, and the Sahel region, or Sahel region. Sahel,
I think.
But this is what I was referring to earlier, how there is a group of different ethnic minority groups that are self-identifying in this region. Okay, they're in Niger, but they're also in Mali. And so they're fighting. And there's a lot of problems with it because there are semi-nomadic peoples who are just getting involved and embroiled in all of these disputes. And do you say to them, well, okay, you just have to go over to Niger and stay in Niger and don't come to Mali because you're bothering us? And the people in Niger might be saying, okay, you just go over to Mali? You just stay in Mali because you're bothering us. So it's causing issues. And then you also have Muslim extremist jihadist groups who've cropped up. And they've started putting pressure. So, maybe they're religion oriented, but they're more terrorist oriented. Because as someone who almost converted to Islam once, I know it to be a religion of peace. But when it comes to a jihadist military, it's like that's the furthest thing from Muslim I can actually think. But they love to self-identify as Muslim. That's really hard. Kind of like the Crusades. Or anyone who likes to identify themselves as Christian, but that it's okay to go around and brutally murder people. You're like, yep. I'm saying nothing over here. I'm just going to keep petting Jayla. Yeah, she's so great. Okay, now Haiti is another big problem. So they sort of declared this peace almost after they killed President Jovenel Moïse in July of 2021. But what happened is just these gangs, roving gangs of violence, just constant, never. It's like the whole country is almost at war, but it's these small criminal gang organization and
like in Colombia, a little bit,
just turf wars,
yeah,
constant turf wars. And nearly half of Haiti's population, some 5.2 million people, need life-saving aid today.
God, that's crazy.
It's hard to wrap your mind around that kind of. Yeah. And then we get to number 9, U.S.-China tensions. Broiling for a while. I mean, did we ever? Nixon tried to do some stuff in the 70s with China. So there was that for a bit.
I mean, there's a little bit of peace in the 1920s and 30s, briefly.
Yeah. The problem is the November meeting in 2023 with U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping sought to reset what had been a sharp slide in two countries' relations, but their core interests are still at conflict. As the Taiwanese elections have caused issues, the Philippines their territory for certain South China Sea interests, because the Philippines are an ally of the U.S., and China's going, no, we have these waters. So this is just an escalating dispute, and it could boil over, and there's a lot of problems going on right now. And then we have number 10, Armenia, Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan's lightning offensive in Nagorno-Karabakh. Karabakh,
I think.
Prompted exodus of almost all of those living there, more than 100,000 people. The question this year, in 2024, is whether Azerbaijan will go further or whether the talks in late 2023 seem to yield some progress. So that's where active mediation is happening right now. And whether Armenia can finally find a way toward peace. And that's been going on for a very long time.
Very, very long time.
Yeah. So that's what's happening. 10 big problems in the world today. Super glad I'm not an international mediator.
Yeah.
How about you? You ready to go and solve the world's problems, Dale?
I would like to.
Yeah? How would
Don't
you
know
solve
how.
some of these?
Don't know how.
How would you solve some of these problems?
You know what? I think I would start with trying to, this might seem weird, but try to encourage critical thinking and secular humanism.
I think the thing is when you're so locked into being right for years and years and years.
It's so hard, yeah.
How you think you're being critical.
Critical thinking and then secular humanism. The problem with that is it's secular.
Yeah, it's not going to float too well with some people.
Yeah, so it needs to be like rebranded as something that it's okay if you're religious, but at least hold these principles that we need to start from a point of caring about the well-being of everyone, even if they think differently than you.
Mm-hmm. I think this is just the very tip of the iceberg of us talking about conflict on an international level. I don't know if this is something we should even consider continuing on with, but we want to hear from you, listeners. Are you someone who's come from a conflict area? Do you see a way out of some of these things? Write to us, toughcallmediation@gmail.com.
Yeah.
Send us your thoughts. I mean, hey, maybe you do have the answer to the world's problems.
And please don't the answer be wiping out a whole group of people.
Yeah, that's not fair. I mean, what if that means you?
Exactly.
I asked this question when I was in my teens. If you knew your death would create world peace tomorrow, would you allow yourself to die? And I asked people that for years and years and years and years. And what I found super interesting is how many people couldn't even wrap their head around the concept. They were just like, really? Well, why would I have to die? This is just a theoretical thing. If you knew absolutely, if you had guaranteed proof that your death will solve all of the world's conflicts.
Somehow. Magic. Yeah. Doesn't matter what it is.
Yep. And people are, well, how long? And I was like, well, that's a good question. Like, I mean, how long would world?
Question. You know, what if it was only 5 minutes or half a second? That's not so worth it anymore. That is a good question. Forever. But let's say forever, right?
Well, I think that's, then you're asking people to not be human anymore, because inevitably we'll find ourselves into conflict. But I eventually started to bookend it by saying, okay, you knew that for the next 3 generations, world peace would occur with your death. Would you do it? Most people still say no, which I find very, very interesting, because I asked someone, I said, well, okay, you're saying no, why? And they said, well, who are you to define what world peace is? Who am I to define? What if it's a kind of peace that I would not be okay with? I was like, ooh,
well, that's true.
Like, what really interesting thing to think about.
Going back to what I had said to please not send. What if world peace just means wiping out everybody?
Yep.
I don't want that. That doesn't help anything.
Robots taking over the world and annihilating the human race.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to die because I'm going to be the first
of the rest
brain
of
that goes into the Borg or whatever it is. Yeah. No, that's no good.
Yeah. That's an interesting question, I suppose, to ask our listeners. Would you? But a lot of people were also just uncomfortable with the idea, and they said, oh, that's just a really morbid question. I just don't want to think about me dying to solve problems. And I was like, but when you think about it, that's how wars are. I'm going to solve my problem by killing people.
Yeah. I mean, technically, every single soldier on the planet should say yes to that question, because they're putting their lives at risk, and there's zero guarantee of peace. Mm-hmm. So they're already kind of answering the question.
Really?
Although I have a feeling a lot of soldiers don't fully realize that that's the question. You know what I mean? They do to a certain degree, but...
Well, I think that's the thing, is depending on how young you are or how naive you are going into it, because there are some veterans who knew exactly what
veterans
they were
for sure.
doing.
Yeah.
Like when they
people who go
signed up,
back and keep signing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or some go in eyes wide open. They're like, I know I am giving my life in the hopes of securing peace for my country and my brethren. And it's
those definitely
such a
would
brave
say
choice.
yes, for sure.
Hats off to veterans. I have an oceans of respect for people who've said, you know what? My life is to be devoted to a cause greater than myself, whether it be right or wrong.
Yeah.
Which is hard when it turned out to be not so great. Like, I think that's the lesson of the Vietnam War, right? A lot of veterans, not even the treatment of veterans. Thankfully, that did change slowly, but it did change a little bit.
Not enough. To be honest.
Not enough. But awareness, I guess awareness changed, perception changed. I know it's really, I'm trying to find some light here.
Maybe in Canada, not so much in the US.
No, it was pretty dark. It was pretty dark. But I think the thing is they go over to this place ill-equipped, ill-prepared, not understanding that these people were fighting for their homes and their lives.
Yeah.
And so,
yep.
Of course, it's going to be some random woman, who looks like they're carrying a baby, but it's going to be a bomb because they think you're in here to invade their home. Yeah. And they answered that question already. Yeah. They're literally dying for it. Yeah. Does this mean I sided with the Khmer Rouge? I do not. But anyway, big questions today. Not a lot of answers. Nope. Yeah. Nope. Not going to be any answers on this one for a while. And I know it's pretty heavy, but if there's anything you'd like to share, if you have anything to talk about a time that you were involved in an international peacekeeping mission, veterans, we want to hear from you. We want to hear your stories. Please write to us. And thank you for listening. Thank you. Bye. You've been listening to Tough Call, a mediation podcast hosted by C.T. Eller and Dale Sheldon. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Discord. This podcast was edited by Jean Sarrazin, with social media and marketing by Jazz Virbadi and Hope Ursek. Original music by Ty Ray Lawton. This podcast was sponsored by Herb Legal LLP, where you can find more episodes at www.herblawservices.com. Thank you for listening.